Professor Hustwit is a scholar of American social history and the civil rights movement. He has been a member of the history faculty at New College of Florida since 2023. Dr. Hustwit earned his BA in history from Kenyon College and a doctorate in American history from the University of Mississippi. Among his publications are James J. Kilpatrick, Salesman for Segregation, and Integration Now, Alexander V. Holmes and the End of Jim Crow Education.
I had to laugh when Casey and Dave asked, to be part of the conference and asked me to do this, slavery in the American Revolution. I thought, well, he gave us an easy one here. Nowadays, when you talk with students, when you teach the Revolution, when you teach the Declaration of Independence, and you read the opening lines, the famous words about equality, they of course they're looking at you expectantly or even skeptically about, well, what about the slavery element of all this? And it's amazing how this gets worked into immediately thinking about the Declaration and the meaning of the Revolution. And I think that the tendency today, of course, is to read the Revolution and the Declaration through the lens of slavery in many instances. And some people see this as kind of an exercise in narrative control or an effort to delegitimate the country's foundings and point out the hypocrisy of some of the founders who owned slaves. Some have pointed to this as evidence of what's been referred to as America's original sin of slavery in the country. You all are familiar with this. And asking these questions about, are we really fighting about the present by, fighting about the past through looking at the present and fighting about what the present meanings of the Revolution and the Declaration are for us. And the answer to that, of course, that's what we're doing, is we're fighting about both, as George Orwell wrote in his dystopian novel 1984, quote, "He who controls the present controls the past. He who controls the past controls the future," end quote. So history is a constant dialogue between the present and the past at all times. But the question of was the American founding and the Revolution, were those tainted by slavery? Is that a fair characterization? And I think that in part, rather than trying to definitively answer this yes or no, those can lead you in two different directions and two extremes. If you go the yes, definitely this tainted the project, you're sort of speaking a la 1619 Project. If you say no to the extreme, that can lead to taking this out of the discourse. We're going to not talk about this, which is also unhelpful. So we need an honest history. We need an honest dialogue about what occurred that educates about the good, the bad, and the ugly about America's founding. And I would say that more than trying to answer this, definitively yes or no, we should also take time to remember that very question has been with us since the very beginning. It's been with us for the last 250 years about whether or not slavery was tainting the American founding or not. To repeat the words of the taunt from Samuel Johnson, the great opponent of American independence, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? Johnson's taunt was especially a telling observation, considering that the man who also declared, "Give me liberty or give me death," Patrick Henry, was one of Virginia's leading slaveholders. So again, this is a tension that's been with us from the beginning. This paradox of slavery and liberty has been here from the get-go. And for hundreds of years, people in what we used to call the West had, felt little discomfort about treating people as possessions. But something is occurring here on the eve of the Revolution, as Johnson's jibe suggests, that many in England and America had begun to feel uneasy about slavery. And I'll wait for Mark to say much more about that, because my main emphasis here is to talk about the revolution and slavery itself and how that operated. So to be sure, there were earlier generations that had never been wholly without anti-slavery spokesmen, but one of the things that was new about the American founding, about this era, is the intertwining of views on slavery with views on politics. the politicizing of the slavery issue was something new and different that's emergent during the Revolution. And so the Revolution is a watershed moment in so many different ways. It's the first time in which the colonies separated themselves from Europeans. It's the founding of the first republic in the Western Hemisphere. It's the founding of America, and it's a founding moment in slavery as well. So all those things going on at the same time. After the Revolution, it wasn't a given that slavery would endure. It was no longer possible to assume that slavery may exist without being defended. And these were debates that were emergent about the future of slavery that affected France, that affected Spain, that affected Brazil, but most importantly affected Britain and then, of course, the United States. So these debates were swirling. There was a presumption, starting with the Revolution and then carrying into the late 18th century, that slavery was morally, if not economically and also politically untenable. But part of what distinguished the founding generation was that critics were opposing slavery in a new way. There had been individuals, small groups, that had raised opposition to slavery prior to the Revolution. But now one of the interesting things that emerges from the Revolution is that there's a new collective voice that begins to emerge about opposing slavery. The turn against slavery in 11 of the colonies was an unintended consequence of the Revolutionary War. Ideals birthed by the Revolution generated anti-slavery discourse, and really only Georgia and South Carolina had virtually no anti-slavery sentiment. But elsewhere throughout the new American states, anti-slavery, there was a new birth of talking about this. Thinking about the colonists and their explanations about why they resisted British rule. Again, arguments that would foment anti-slavery views tied to the issue of slavery in many ways. In the opening years of the Revolution, patriots argued about their rights as Englishmen. I think that was the first emphasis. That was the first point of departure. We sometimes forget this, that we talk about natural rights, of course. We talk about this then leading to what kind of form of government do we want. But we also need to remember that before there was the move towards natural rights, American colonials were making the pitch that they should be recognized as fellow Englishmen. They should be recognized as co-equals in this project. And that's part of why they decided to move towards revolution, is because, of course, they weren't being recognized as full Englishmen. They were something less than. They were being treated as inferiors. So the talk about natural rights really was a recourse when you're not recognized with your English rights as full Englishmen. Then you start to appeal to a higher law and talk about your natural rights. That was the overarching pitch. So remaining good and loyal Englishmen got dumped along with the tea. And once you talk the talk about natural rights, of course, you have to walk the walk as well. And that's as obvious to us today as it was to people in the 1760s and 1770s. There's also no question that revolutionary language pointed out a fundamental American paradox. The Revolution put in sharp relief the difference between ideals and practices. We must break with Britain to defend human freedom. We hold these truths to be self-evident. We go on and on about liberty, about equality, about justice. But many of these same people, of course, also owned human beings. How do we reconcile these things? Can you? But it's the great American contradiction. It's part of what makes us us. And Jefferson's creedal statement about natural rights and equality, all men are created equal. This becomes embedded in the American political ideology. Okay. So many of you are teachers, and so we, in part, what I was asked to do was talk a little bit about the function of slavery within the Revolution, how this plays out, and also thinking about Black participation in the American Revolution, and then we'll talk more about anti-slavery discourse emergent from the Revolution as well. In terms of Black participation in the war itself, the period of conflict, the actual fighting, really stirred things up in the realm of slavery. For one, the war created confusion. It created disorder, what we would call the fog of war. But wartime also provided opportunities for slaves to escape. There was mass confusion during the war that enabled some slaves to free plantations. Many perhaps posed as free people during the Revolution itself. And during the course of the war, what happens is that British commanders on the ground spied an opportunity. They recognized that American patriots in the South were vulnerable in a time of war. And by doing so, they recognized that they could force the patriots to fight on two fronts. The British to the front with slaves to your back, if you're a slaveholder, especially in the South. In Massachusetts, but it wasn't restricted to just the southern theater of the war. Massachusetts had more slaves than any other state in New England. We think that there were about 5,000 enslaved people in Massachusetts at the time of the Revolution. And we also know that during the occupation of Boston, where, in Massachusetts, where the war breaks out, we know that some enslaved people went to British lines automatically and volunteered themselves to General Thomas Gage and said, we'll help you scouting and otherwise. So this is something that's emergent on the ground from the get-go. I included just sort of a little packet for you today. I thought this might be kind of helpful as sort of some reference points. And we can get back to this in discussion if it's useful as well. But I think on one side I've got some quotes, some snippets of 3 different documents, and I'll make reference to those, and then we can talk about them in more depth. I've also got this graph showing you the numbers of importations of slaves, and then some scribbled notes here that my students often can't read. Just so you know, I was a student of Winthrop Jordan's, who was a great historian of American slavery at the University of Mississippi. And so this is actually Win Jordan's graph that I'm giving to you now. And also, if you don't like the handwriting, blame that on Win. And then on the back side, I've got a graph of a sort of a demographic scheme there that you can see to show you concentrations of blacks in America at the time of the Revolution. And just for your own reference, Win Jordan created this map as well. So anyway, we'll get to a couple of these things. So the first quote that I've got for you is from the British side of the story. And this is the famous Lord Dunmore who issues this proclamation. Lord Dunmore, who is the last colonial governor of Virginia, who gives this famous proclamation in November of 1775. And I've given you just a little bit of it, but he issues this proclamation, and it's an audacious proposition. Dunmore offered freedom. This is in the first half year. This is in the first 5 months of the outbreak of the Revolution, and Dunmore offered freedom, but this is the caveat, to slaves owned by rebels. It was just to slaves owned by the Patriot forces. And so there were built-in restrictions with the proclamation. You must belong to a rebel, you've got to join me, and you've got to bear arms. There were 3 components to the offer of freedom. So Dunmore was trying to raise a black fighting force to oppose Virginia's patriots. And so flight from slavery into the sheltering arms of an occupying army. This was now a new option. This is something different that's being proposed during the American Revolution. And as a result of Dunmore's proclamation, which many of you are probably familiar with to an extent, there's a mass defection, there's mass disruption in Virginia. Runaway slaves in choosing to flee from their owners and seek the British, deprived the patriots of wealth. Of course, you're stripping them of their labor, of their wealth, and it's also sowing discord in Virginia at the same time. So it's a momentous event in Virginia. And we think that something like overall about 50,000 slaves joined the British during the course of the American Revolution. It's an incredible number of people who seek freedom with the British. And by the way, most of that history of enslaved people going to the British lines was not something that was taught in America for years. It wasn't until the 1920s when the great black historian Carter Woodson first started to write about this and point this out, that slaves were fleeing to the British forces, that became something that more and more Americans became aware of. In Virginia alone, Thomas Jefferson estimated that nearly 30,000 slaves walked off plantations to find sanctuary among the British. Roughly 2,000 slaves reached British lines in Norfolk. Dunmore established what he called the Ethiopian Regiment. This was his black fighting force of the men who came to the British lines. And they wore uniforms. They wore very simple uniforms. They had tunics, basically, and they had a sash that said, "Liberty to slaves," on the sash. So for the first time in history, emancipation became a weapon of war. I can say more about that later. Finding Dunmore wasn't necessarily easy. There was a good deal of vigilance on the part of slaveholders. White Virginians were outraged about Dunmore's proclamation of freedom. And this is not a story that turned out well for many of those who sought freedom among the British. Again, we can talk about this more a little bit later. The second document that I've got is, this is more how this operated, how emancipation operated from the bottom up. We tend to look at emancipation during the war and slavery during the Revolution as a top-down enterprise. The second document is by Boston King, who wrote one of the earliest slave narratives. And Boston King gives you a snapshot of what it looked like as British forces were decamping from New York City, which they'd occupied for most of the American Revolution. And there's this real moment of panic as the British are evacuating, and would they take these runaway slaves who had taken up the British on this offer of freedom, would they be evacuated with the British? In this instance, although it's not always the case, in this instance, the British actually followed through on their word and evacuated as many black people as they could, as many former slaves as they could, and sent them to Nova Scotia or other locations around the British Empire. I'm jumping around here a little bit, but I'm getting the cue from Michael that I'm short on time. During the American Revolution, there was never any parliamentary policy about abolition. There was only improvisation by British officers on the ground. And this is how this operated. They're not abolitionists. They're out to win a war. They recognized a strategic advantage in offering emancipation to slaves. But they also realized in the course of the Revolution that the British realized they could also make an ideological point as well. In order to counter the American revolutionaries' claim of offering liberty, equality, these natural rights, the British could offer the counterclaim of saying, aha, we're really the ones who stand for order. We're really the ones who offer liberty to the enslaved. And so the patriots are not really the ones fighting for liberty. This is a bit of what we would call a cope, but it's also an important reminder that although we talk about the shot heard round the world as coming from Lexington and Concord, the shot heard round the world for freedom for blacks in America at that time was Dunmore's proclamation. And in many senses, those enslaved who took Dunmore and other British figureheads up on this offer of freedom, they in many ways became the first black founding fathers, some would argue. Okay. The Continental Forces also offered freedom to the enslaved, to blacks, not on the scale that the British did. The Continental Congress would eventually offer something like 3,000 enslaved freedom to fight for Washington's army. We know that about 5,000 black soldiers fought in the Continental Forces. Many of them, the majority, were slaves. They were either fighting on behalf of masters who didn't want to fight, so you would send the slave in your place. We also know that although many of them showed up to fight as slaves in the Continental Forces, that many of them also had an expectation of freedom. They hoped that by fighting on behalf of the American Patriot Forces that they would be granted freedom. Interesting to note that among the forces who fought for Connecticut, Michael's home state, Of the 289 blacks who volunteered to fight for Connecticut forces, 5 gave the surname when they were asked. They're being enrolled, enlisted, and they gave the surname Liberty. 18, when they signed up in the Continental Forces, reported that their last name was Freedom or Freeman. So this expectation of liberty was there. We also know that black soldiers fought in integrated units. They also fought in 3 separate units. There were 3 separate units raised, one by Massachusetts, one by Rhode Island, and then there was a Haitian regiment that was sent by France that fought in Savannah. The Rhode Island regiment, by the way, was also they called it an all-black regiment, but it was a mixed regiment. There were also Indians, there were indigenous forces that fought, and I just got the 1-minute note. So there's a little bit more to say here about how opposition to slavery and slavery operated within the course of the Revolution, the number of colonies and then states that turned against slavery began to offer gradual freedom. That's actually the last document in there is the 1777 petition in Massachusetts, where enslaved people petitioned the state legislature and wanted a gradual abolition law passed in Massachusetts that got tabled and didn't go anywhere. But it's an interesting look again at how emancipation operated from the bottom up outside the halls of government. And I think that just in closing here, I think that the most stunning thing about how slavery operated during the Revolution is, and again, this is an unintended consequence, is that for the first time in world history, warfare became synonymous with emancipation. That had never happened. Going back to ancient times up into the modern era, when there were wars, the expectation was captivity, bondage, some form of slavery. I own you now, I possess you now. But for the first time in world history, during the American Revolution, it switches. And fighting and warfare now becomes associated with emancipation. And I think I'll leave it there. Okay, and we can come back and I'm happy to talk more, take some questions, but I'll turn things over to Mark. Thank you.
Join us in falling in love with America again.